and that these practices are revealing a whole new kind of science. This is very important. Those of you who've studied philosophy of science, Karl Popper, for example, who said that new paradigms entail new practices that disclose new kinds of data. So that meditation and the experiences of meditation comprise a whole new kind of data that can also be studied with the rigor of the scientific method. And that's now beginning to happen. And that's now beginning to awaken Western scientists to a whole realm of consciousness. But this whole thing is in its complete infancy. This is really important to understand. So that the ancient wisdom of the mystics is something that Western science has had really no knowledge of, and is only now just beginning to dip its toe into. So the science of consciousness is really brand new. Consciousness, human consciousness, has traditionally in science been really more or less dismissed, or more or less just set aside as a kind of side effect of the brain physiology, the neurophysiology, and the neurotransmitters of the brain. That's been the orthodoxy. And that isn't really satisfying. And the way you can see that it's not satisfying, and the way they prove that is the case is because they say if you mess with the neurons in the brain, it messes with the consciousness. Therefore, consciousness comes from the brain. But that last therefore does not hold. It's equivalent to saying if you mess with the innards of a television set, it messes with the picture, therefore the program in the TV is coming from inside the TV. And we know that's not the case. So there's this whole revolution that's beginning to happen in science around needing a credible theory of consciousness, which we don't have. And that's okay, but we need to recognize that we need it. And Bohm was saying this when he said there's energy and matter. This is what science traditionally has dealt with. There's a third fundamental building block, consciousness, and the three together are what comprise the nature of reality as we understand it. And it's interesting for those of you who know the Bhagavad Gita, the Gita has the three gunas, which are sattva, rajas, and tamas. And sattva is essentially consciousness. Rajas is energy, tamas is matter or inertia. So, interestingly, there's one of these correspondences where some of the ancient philosophies had some of the fundamental building blocks that science are now coming to realize. Okay, so now here's where it gets juicier and funner and kind of visually satisfying. So if you're starting to fall asleep, wake up for this part because you'll like it more, I think. Because we're going to go into fractals. This holographic part that Bohm spoke of, where each part contains the whole, really speaks to a fundamental structure of consciousness in reality that is so exquisite and so beautiful. And it's reflected in the mathematics of what's called fractal geometry. And I'm sure many of you have seen these fractals. The simplest example of the fractals is something called the Mandelbrot set. This is a mathematical structure here that is essentially the plot of a particular nonlinear equation. You may recall from high school algebra, you plot y equals x squared and out comes a parabola, right? You make a plot of a graph and you get a pictorial representation of a formula. Well, this is the same thing, except that it's a particular formula in the complex plane. But this has a very unique structure in that let me just show you what happens. So what we're going to do here is zoom in on this left-hand part right over here and just kind of blow this part up. So we're magnifying it as we go in. And again, we're blowing up right there, and that brings us to here. And then we blow up this center part and we get this, and you can see that little oblong there. We blow that up and we get this. Now at this point we're 1,000,000 times magnified, so we're taking a deep dive into this thing. And you can see that cross at the center there. We blow that up and we get this. It's quite beautiful. I mean, this is all mathematical structure. There's nothing created by the computer here. Computers just plotted the graph. So all the richness and structure of this is in the equation itself. Then you see that little star at the center there, and we blow that up and we get this. And then if you see that little black dot at the center, we blow that up, and voila! Look what appears. An exact replica of the original. But this one is 136 million times smaller than the original. So what we find is deeply embedded within this original, right here over in this corner, way over here somewhere, is a tiny little version of the entire set itself. And that tiny little version that's embedded way over here is just one of billions that are all throughout this entire thing. Anywhere that you expand along this boundary, you'll find these embedded replicas of the whole set, just like the one we just saw. And now it turns out if you take this one and start going into its boundary, going and exploring this, you'll find that it too has all these little miniature babies contained within itself. And here's the other amazing thing. No two of these is exactly the same. They all have the same body, the same head, that same basic shape, but these little nodules on them are slightly different on every single one of them. And there's an infinite number of them. So in science, this is called nested sets of self-similar structures. But I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that what this really is a modern scientific discovery of an ancient principle of alchemy, known as the principle of correspondence. From Hermeticism, from the ancient traditions, often articulated as above, so below, as within, so without. This is the idea that the microcosm is a replication of the macrocosm, that somehow, as Blake hints at, the universe is contained in a grain of sand, and the infinite, the eternal, in an hour. This is the essence of the structure of consciousness, in my view, and it really helps to illuminate the teachings and the insights of the mystics and the religious traditions across the globe. So I want to, first of all, let's look at how this principle manifests in the physical universe. This structure, by the way, any structure that has this kind of self-similarity on all these different scales in mathematics is called a fractal. That's just a term that was given to it. And it means that it has some quality of like the Russian dolls. You know, you have a Russian dolls and you open it up and you get a littler one, you open that up and you get a littler one, and you keep going. And you have this kind of infinite regress of these smaller ones contained within the larger one. So what it turns out, though, is that these things are found throughout nature. Take a look at this fern. So there's the whole fern, and you take one little leaf, and this is a miniature version of the whole thing. And you find throughout nature these systems. Another term they give for it in mathematics is scale invariance. Because here's another example. This is a broccoli. Some of you have seen this Romanesque broccoli. So there's a broccoli. If you take just one little nodule of it, this is a miniature of the whole thing. And you take one little nodule here, that's a miniature of this whole thing, and this is a miniature of that whole thing. It's a fractal structure. Another example, there's a close-up of the broccoli surface. Another example, the tree branch. If you take this part of the tree right here and blow it up, this is like the trunk, and each of these are like the branches, and it looks just like this whole thing. If you take this little part right up here and blow that up, it'll look like this whole thing. Because basically it has this structure that a small part of it, magnified, looks like the original. Lightning, same thing. Lightning has a fractal structure. It has this scale invariance. A part of it blown up looks like the whole. The circulatory system is a fractal structure. The respiratory system, the trachea and the lungs, are a fractal structure. We see these throughout. This is the human eye. Right up here, right there, you can see just the bottom part of the pupil. This is the iris. These are the blood vessels in the human eye. You can see that they also have a fractal structure. These are neurons in the brain. This is showing some of the parallels. What has emerged in this field of fractal mathematics is that these fractals have an uncanny capacity to model natural systems because of this self-similar structure that they have. And here we see on the left, this is the spiral, this is a spiral from the Mandelbrot set, that mathematical structure that we just saw. That's embedded within it. And this is a photograph of the grand spiral galaxy. So there's a kind of a clear correspondence there. Now, another example of a fractal process, this is a very simple process on a computer where you start with this triangle, and then you do a transformation from that to this. That is done very simply on a computer by just typing in a few lines of code, and it runs it through that. And then what you do is you do this same transformative process that you did from this triangle to this. You do that to each of these triangles, and this then becomes this. And then you do that to each of these little triangles, and this becomes this. So this thing very quickly evolves from this with a simple transformation rule. You're taking this rule that goes from that to that and simply applying it repeatedly. And this thing then it transforms to this, which begins to look like what? A mountain landscape of some kind. Now, if you just add a coloring rule and a couple other similar algorithms, you get this image. This is a fractal image. It's not a photograph. It's generated on the computer with a few simple rules that basically then replicate the full complexity of a gorgeous mountain landscape. So this is an illustration of how fractals have turned out to be incredibly powerful in modeling and mimicking natural complex systems. Here's another example of as above, so below. This is a brain cell. This is an image from astrophysics of the universe. Scale here is a few microns. Scale here is billions of light years across. And this is a photograph Hubble telescope that was dubbed the Eye of God. This is the Helix Nebula. So this is, I throw this in parenthetically, this is at the forefront of the Mandelbrot set research. This is a new way of plotting the graph using a different algorithm. This algorithm focuses on how long the particular trajectory spends in each of the pixels, and it measures that time and plots this out. So it's a plot of a graph of a simple nonlinear process, but what does it look like? It looks like a kind of a deity. I mean, you can sort of see the eyes. It looks like one of these shimmering Tibetan deities or something. And this is quite new. This is only in the last 3 or 4 years. And this is now being explored. These complex mathematical structures that when plotted in a certain way start to look like these angelic beings. It's very bizarre, but it's there in the mathematics. So the proposal that I'm then making in this book is that consciousness itself has this fractal structure. Fractal meaning it has this process of self-similar structures embedded within it. And that this is the deep meaning of the statement, for example, by Rumi, who said, "The secret turning in your heart is the entire universe turning." And by the way, how many of you have ever been inspired by Rumi? We all have, right? I mean, Rumi is like, he's in a class by himself when it comes to divine love. Well, what I want to just say, and this is another little correction for Islamophobia, if you love Rumi, you already, whether you know it or not, you already love the sacred essence and wisdom of Islam. Listen to this line from Rumi. This is from Rumi. "I am the slave of the Quran while I still have life. I am dust on the path of Muhammad, the chosen one. If anyone interprets my words in any other way, I deplore that person and I deplore their words." And what I talk about here in the book is how Rumi's wisdom comes entirely from the canonical sources of the Quran and the Hadith, the Ahadith, the sayings of the Prophet, which he then put and expressed in poetic and metaphorical terms using other kinds of images. But the whole foundation of his incredible genius is the sacred wisdom of the Islamic tradition. That's important for us to remember. And when we are inspired by Rumi, to remember that is the source of his wisdom. So, and in fact, the Mathnawi, his great masterpiece, is called, in Persia, it's called the Persian Quran. That is so revered that they hold it essentially close to being equal to the Quran itself. And as one of the Rumi scholars explained so carefully, Rumi is so insightful in taking the insights of the Quran and reweaving them that it's almost impossible to tell. You can't. It's not easy to parse out unless you are an extremely sophisticated Islamic scholar. So just know that you love the Quran and you love the Hadith if you love Rumi. Okay, so the secret turning in your heart is the entire universe turning. So what is Rumi talking about here? This is not just a metaphor. He's talking about something happening in the interior essence of your heart, which is also happening throughout the entire cosmos, and those two are one. It's one process. Different scales, but one process. And that is the process, the dynamic process that we call the living God. And so basically, because consciousness has a fractal structure, then the human being, you remember when we saw those fractals and you found that tiny one 100 million times smaller that's identical to the original, this is also true of consciousness. And that means that in the depth of our hearts, we can experience the infinity of the cosmic consciousness of the entire cosmos and literally of the living God in our hearts, because consciousness is structured in a fractal way. And so those pictures that we saw of the fractals are really a kind of mathematical photograph of how consciousness works. Now, let's look at, thinking in those fractal-like terms, let's look at some of these familiar phrases from the scriptures. You were made in the image of God. So you see this idea, you were made in the image of God, that there is an identity in the structure of the human being in its essence, and the structure of God in the divine essence. And we are made in that essence. In the Bhagavad Gita, I'm still learning this little thing, sorry. We see the self in every creature and all of creation in the self. So beautiful, so incredible, really, when you meditate on that deeply. All of creation is contained in your inmost self. The Chandogya Upanishad talks about this. In the lotus of the heart is the infinite, and in that infinite is contained within your heart through a doorway about the size of your thumb. And the Upanishads, they specifically recommend, meditating on that little thumb-sized doorway, and through that gateway and coming into the infinite realization of God. And then this beautiful hadith from Allah. So this is Allah speaking. Heaven and earth are too small to contain me, but I fit easily inside the heart of my beloved devotee. I love this one because heaven and earth are too small to contain me. The entire 100 billion galaxies, each of which has 100 billion stars that science tells us of, that's much too small for God to fit inside of. But your heart, the full infinity of God fits inside of. Easily. And then in the mystical realization, what happens? This is from one of the hadiths, Al-Siraj. He says, my devotee never ceases to draw near to me with acts of devotion. This is God speaking. The devotee never ceases to draw near to me with acts of devotion. And when I love him, that is, when God loves you, I become the eyes by which he sees, the mouth through which he speaks, the feet by which he walks. So God becomes your seeing, your hearing, your walking. So basically what happens, the human being is replaced by the divine being. The human being is divinized into a walking God upon the earth, which is what Jesus said at one point. Did ye not say ye are gods? That's who we're intended to be. male and female gods and goddesses walking the earth. That's how it was. That's how we were created. That's the Creator's intention. Of course, we've trampled on it and made a rather mess of things. But this is Meister Eckhart, this I and that God become one is. So what happens is in the union with God is there's a dynamic union that's so radical that the I and God are both destroyed. There's no I left and there's no God left, because God is a concept and God is an othering that we speak of. But when the union happens, then there is only this isness is left. And then, as Julian of Norwich described it, we are all in God enclosed, and God is enclosed in us. And what Meister Eckhart says so powerfully is that when God gives himself or herself to the devotee, God pours all of his infinity, all of his blessedness, all of his divinity, all of his richness, holds nothing back. This is really profound. It's no wonder these people were dismissed as heretics. How could someone claim that God could give all of his infinity to a single human being who's only 6 feet tall? You can see how the eyes of the flesh deceive us. But the eyes of the heart know this infinite truth, and the mystics have realized this infinite truth. And the heart of the human being beats with the essence of the heart of God as one heart. You know, another fractal metaphor for this is the cell. Every cell in your body has its life only by and because of the heartbeat. And that heartbeat that beats moment to moment to moment, each of which is a gift of divine grace, by the way. In the Upanishads it says, we live not by the heart that beats from moment to moment, but by the one who makes the heart beat from moment to moment. Every single heartbeat is a new gift of grace from God, as is every in-breath. And each cell in the body has its entire life because of that grace that's given with each heartbeat. And that cell is alive with the pulse of that heartbeat. And in that sense, that cell has a direct experience of the biological heart. It is in lockstep with the heart. And if that pulse, if that heartbeat were to cease for even just a few minutes, both the little tiny cell and the gigantic heart would both die very quickly. So they are fundamentally interlinked. And what I'm saying tonight is that just as the cell is to the heart of the body, so is the soul to the heart of God. That the soul, the human soul, carries this spiritual heartbeat that is one with the heartbeat at the very core of the absolute Godhead. That is the reality. So each of us literally is a mystical soul in the body of God. And when the mystics say that they have realized the living heart of God in their own being, they are speaking the truth. And they are working with the fact that it is a fractal realization. They have discovered that full infinity within that miniature fractal that they are. And then finally from Teresa of Avila, this famous statement, Christ has no body but yours, no mouth but yours. So I want to give you a little, and I want to do a time check. What are we? 8:45. So it's about time for me to, I want to show you this video here. This is showing you the structure of fractals. This again is that Mandelbrot set, but it's a zoom that goes for 245 orders of magnitude. And just think of this now. This is a mathematical graph. The topology of it is determined entirely by the mathematics, has nothing to do with the computer. The computer's just revealing it. These structures were not understood or known or discovered until about 30 years ago. It looks like you're on some psychedelic acid trip or something, but it's simply revealing this mathematical structure. What I'm saying is this, that this mathematics, first of all, This mathematics predates human existence. It's inherent in the nature of numbers. The minute you have multiplicity, you have fractals. You can't not have them. They're a logical consequence of numbers. So what you're seeing here is something. Did you see that little miniature Mandelbrot go by? Now keep watching, and you'll see we're diving deep, 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 deep. 245 orders of magnitude. The entire universe is only 27 orders of magnitude bigger than you are. By that I mean your arm is about 1 foot long, right? The diameter of the universe is 10 to the 27th feet. 10 to the 27th means a billion, billion, billion. So the universe is a billion, billion, billion feet across. That equals 14.3 billion light years, if you do the math. So, you know, it's big, but it's only 27 orders of magnitude big. This video does 245 orders of magnitude. And yet you keep finding this same structure repeated, repeated, repeated. And you'll also notice, now notice something here, because I find this quite fascinating. Look at all the fanfare. It sure looks like there's going to be some really remarkable thing that's going to emerge at the center of all of this, doesn't it? I mean, this is all in the mathematics. The computer is simply revealing the topology, but there it is. And I think of that as a mathematical metaphor for how God holds each one of us as a blessed miniature God, created in the image of God. Think of it in a consciousness level that is so precious to God that it is adorned with all of this kind of blessing all around it. And each one of us is held as that little jewel in the depths of the heart of God, as one of God's jewels, because each one of us is a replica of God. So what I'm saying is that consciousness is a higher and more profound and more refined form of this fractal consciousness. So that keeps going. I mean, you get the idea. So to bring this to a close so we can take some questions, let me get back to, still struggling here. Let me shrink that. This is a nice one to show too, but maybe I'll do that later. I want to kind of come to my closing here. This one, let's see, how do I get back to my slideshow? I'm curious if anyone recognizes this photograph. This is this was published in about a year and a half ago on the front cover of Nature, which is the leading scientific journal of the world. And this is a composite photograph generated from telescopes from all over the planet. So they coordinated the data of telescopes from all over the planet and the Hubble telescope, and they coordinated all of them around following the trajectories of galaxies. So in this composite, and it's a photograph in the sense it's actual data. And in this, every point of light here represents a galaxy. And the lines, the white lines, represent the trajectory of a galaxy through space. And this is the collective composite plot of the trajectories of 100,000 galaxies. And it forms what they knew was a type of what's called an attractor. That they knew the galaxies were all moving towards something, but only in the last couple of years have they been getting a visual on what it is that the galaxies are converging toward. And this is the first image they've ever had of it. Now you'll notice that they concentrate along certain lines here, and right here is the galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy that we are in, where it says you are here. But all of these are the other galaxies. Now this, of course, is a two-dimensional version of a three-dimensional object, so I want to show you a three-dimensional version of it and show you what this looks like. And that is right here. Okay, that sort of gives it away. There it is. There's the data. Now when you turn it in 3D, you see you get this. And these lines fit very naturally into the shape of the human heart. So that is, this right here is that attractor. That is what the trajectory of the galaxies are leading toward. and it looks very much, and even has the three-dimensional sort of shape and structure, and even some of the energetic lines of the human heart. This is very new stuff. This has only come out in the last year or so. So where is my PowerPoint? Now I'm going to get back to my PowerPoint here. Okay, can we get... So let's see, I'm having computer problems now. How do I get this to work again? There we go. Okay. So I want to conclude now with this. I don't know how to make it full screen. Oh, I do this. Here we go. Did that do it? Okay, so here is the relationship I'm suggesting between this fractal mathematics and the structure of consciousness, and particularly divine consciousness. So here on the left, here's the mathematical situation. Here's the formula. Here's the fractal process that we've been looking at. So this is a mathematical creation which is the plot of this graph. So there's a graph, a particular formula that gives rise to this particular structure, which has this self-embedded, self-replications embedded throughout it. And this is one formula of an infinite number of possible formulas. So you have a whole infinity of possible formulas. You then select somehow one of them, and out of that comes this particular mathematical creation. So what I'm saying here is we have a similar process in terms of manifestation. We have the absolute infinite Godhead that then self-restricts in some way to a particular form or flavor of divinity, and that divinity then is like a